Breaking news from the State House. One of the big bills in front of the Senate.
Well, later today, a landmark civil rights case is set to be argued before the Supreme Court.
Here in the U.S., the U.S. Supreme Court is hearing arguments on a $10 billion lawsuit,
saying setting a higher threshold in an emergency could mean life or death.
One manufacturer just discontinued an entire product line after receiving threatening letters, and their stock price jumped 7% within 30 days. Wall Street didn't punish them for surrendering. They rewarded them, and while everyone's celebrating this as a victory for safety, the financial documents tell a completely different story about what's really happening behind closed doors. This isn't about protecting communities from dangerous products. This is about using legal costs as a weapon to systematically eliminate affordable firearms from the American market, and the people funding this campaign just allocated $38 million specifically for manufacturer pressure operations. By the time you understand how this strategy actually works and who it's designed to hurt most, you'll never look at these corporate announcements the same way again. Here's the financial reality that advocacy groups desperately don't want you examining too closely. That first manufacturer who announced they were discontinuing their controversial product line didn't make that decision because of legal threats or public pressure. They made a calculated business decision that was already in motion before the first threatening letter even arrived. The company's quarterly earnings report, buried in the financial disclosures that most people never bother reading, revealed something absolutely stunning. They had already planned to phase out those specific models due to rising manufacturing costs and increasingly thin profit margins that made continued production economically questionable. Those statistics being cited about 2% usage in criminal incidents, the company's own internal analysis showed even worse news for their bottom line. Warranty claims on those particular models were running 40% higher than their other product lines, costing them an estimated $18 million annually in replacements, repairs, and customer service. The 90-day timeline from receiving the cease and desist letter to announcing discontinuation wasn't because they were scrambling to respond to legal pressure. It's because the redesigned replacement models were already in final testing phases, scheduled for market release within 120 days anyway, according to their product development roadmap. So this company took the political heat for what was fundamentally a business decision they'd already made for purely financial reasons. And now they're being held up as a shining example of corporate responsibility while they laugh all the way to the bank with a 7% stock price increase and glowing coverage from institutional investors who love their ESG compliance rating. They eliminated a money-losing product line, got praised for it, and watched their market valuation climb. That's not surrendering to pressure. That's masterful business strategy disguised as social responsibility. Let's break down those statistics being used to justify this entire campaign, because the way advocacy groups present these numbers is fundamentally dishonest when you understand what the data actually means. They cite 8,400 criminal incidents involving firearms with specific trigger mechanisms over a 5-year period, and they present that number as if it's proof of an epidemic requiring immediate intervention, but they deliberately omit critical context that completely changes what those numbers actually represent. First, ATF trace data doesn't prove a firearm was used in any crime. It only demonstrates that law enforcement requested information about that firearm's ownership history. Approximately 35% of all ATF traces involve firearms that were never used criminally, but were simply found during unrelated investigations, recovered from estates after someone passed away, or traced as part of trafficking investigations where no crime was actually committed by the person possessing the firearm. That means roughly 2,900 of those 8,400 traces might not involve any criminal misuse whatsoever. They're just firearms that got caught up in law enforcement paperwork for completely innocent reasons. Here's another number that's being deliberately hidden from public discussion. Of the 267 illegal modification cases the ATF actually prosecuted last year, only 89 involved the specific component that these advocacy groups are targeting with their legal campaign. That's 33% of illegal modification cases, and those 89 prosecuted cases represent approximately 0.0059% of the 15 million firearms currently in circulation with that particular component design. But when advocacy groups present this data to state attorneys, general offices, and media outlets, they systematically strip away all context and make it sound like we're facing an epidemic of illegal modifications threatening public safety. The statistical dishonesty becomes even more obvious when you consider what they're not comparing these numbers against. 15 million units in circulation over multiple decades, 89 criminal prosecutions in a single year. That's a compliance rate exceeding 99.99%. In any other consumer product category, that would be considered an extraordinary safety record, but instead of acknowledging that overwhelming compliance, advocacy groups focus exclusively on the microscopic fraction of misuse and demand the entire product category be eliminated. Now let's talk about the legal costs and reveal who's actually funding this coordinated pressure campaign. Those legal defense costs ranging between $1.2 and $3.5 million per lawsuit, that's just the visible tip of what this operation is actually costing the firearms industry. And when you follow the money trail, you discover exactly who's funding this systematic attack on manufacturers. The three largest advocacy groups leading this effort have combined annual budgets exceeding $175 million, with approximately $38 million specifically allocated for manufacturer litigation and pressure campaigns. Think about that number for a moment. $38 million dedicated exclusively to suing gun manufacturers and creating legal pressure. They're not worried about actually winning these lawsuits in court. They're weaponizing the cost of legal defense itself as a tool to force business decisions. A mid-size firearms manufacturer typically operates on profit margins between 8 and 12%. That means a $3 million legal defense cost equals the profit from roughly $25 to $40 million in actual sales. The advocacy groups understand perfectly well that manufacturers can survive one or two legal battles, but coordinated legal pressure from 5 different states simultaneously creates an existential financial threat, even to well-capitalized companies with strong balance sheets. Here's what makes this strategy truly insidious. The Protection of Lawful Commerce and Arms Act specifically protects manufacturers from liability for criminal misuse of their products, which means these lawsuits will ultimately fail when they reach final judgments. The advocacy groups absolutely know this. They're staffed with competent lawyers who understand the law. But they also know that defending against legally frivolous lawsuits still costs millions of dollars and creates financial pressure that can force business decisions without ever winning a single case in court. The National Shooting Sports Foundation estimates the firearms industry has spent over $140 million in the past 3 years defending against these coordinated legal threats, and exactly 0 of those cases resulted in plaintiff victories, not one. Every dollar of that $140 million was spent defending against lawsuits that ultimately failed, but the damage was already done through the defensive costs themselves. That 8 to 12% price increase on pistols that consumers are now seeing at retailers, that's the direct financial cost of defending constitutional rights in court getting passed to buyers. And it's happening while advocacy groups funded by billionaire donors continue filing lawsuits they know they'll eventually lose, because losing in court doesn't matter when the real goal is economic attrition. Everyone assumes these advocacy groups want to eliminate specific firearm models they consider dangerous, but internal strategy documents that have surfaced through discovery in various lawsuits tell a completely different story. They don't want to eliminate dangerous products. They want to eliminate affordable firearms entirely, creating economic barriers that accomplish through pricing what they couldn't achieve through legislation. That manufacturer producing 600,000 units annually with 70% going to first-time and budget-conscious buyers, that's precisely why they're being systematically targeted. Analysis of the advocacy group's targeting strategy reveals they've focused almost exclusively on manufacturers whose products retail below $500, while largely ignoring premium brands with prices above $800. They're not going after expensive custom firearms that wealthy collectors purchase. They're targeting the firearms most commonly purchased by working-class Americans, minorities, and first-time buyers who can't afford premium options. Push that typical price point from $450 to between $550 and $700 through forced redesigns and legal defense costs, and you've effectively priced out an estimated 25 million potential gun owners without changing a single law or winning a single legislative vote. You've created a de facto economic barrier to Second Amendment rights that disproportionately impacts the Americans least able to afford higher prices. Those technically impossible demands in the cease and desist letters aren't mistakes or examples of overreach by overzealous lawyers. They're intentionally designed to be impossible to meet, which reveals the actual goal behind this entire campaign. When advocacy groups demand design modifications that would prevent any unauthorized alterations whatsoever, they're not seeking reasonable compliance with legitimate safety concerns. They're creating conditions that guarantee non-compliance, no matter what manufacturers do. Firearms industry engineers have analyzed the technical requirements in these demand letters and concluded that meeting them would require abandoning the modular design principles that make firearms repairable, maintainable, and reliable for legitimate users. You can't create a firearm that's completely impossible to modify without also making it impossible to repair when parts wear out or impossible to maintain for long-term reliability. The demands are mutually exclusive with basic functionality. The demand for immediate production cessation affecting 1,200 manufacturing jobs and 50,000 monthly units isn't about safety concerns. It's economic warfare designed to inflict maximum financial damage while redesign efforts allegedly proceed. That proposed $200 million retrofit program for 2.1 million units already in circulation, that's not a genuine safety proposal. That's a poison pill designed to be economically impossible to implement. That list of 14 additional manufacturers and 27 specific models being circulated isn't random targeting. It's a calculated rollout designed to systematically collapse the firearms industry through sequential economic pressure. Public records requests in several states revealed internal emails showing direct coordination between advocacy groups and state attorneys' general offices in 9 states, with specific timelines for launching pressure campaigns against different manufacturers in carefully planned sequence rather than all at once. They learned from their initial success that sequential targeting creates maximum fear and uncertainty within the industry because each manufacturer watches what happens to the previous target before deciding how to respond. It's designed to create a climate where manufacturers are terrified they might be next, leading to preemptive capitulation even before receiving threatening letters. The incremental market elimination strategy follows a specific order that's been documented in their planning materials. First, eliminate the cheapest options under $400 by making those price points economically unviable. Then target mid-range options between $400 and $600 through the same legal pressure tactics. Finally, pressure premium manufacturers once consumers have no affordable alternatives remaining and are forced to pay whatever prices the surviving manufacturers demand. The 47 law enforcement agencies that adopted the targeted model aren't mentioned in the threatening letters because acknowledging that professional law enforcement trusts these products would undermine the entire safety narrative. If these firearms are genuinely dangerous and poorly designed, why are police departments issuing them to officers? The answer is they're not dangerous, they're affordable. And that's the real problem from the advocacy group's perspective. This coordinated campaign has nothing to do with product safety or preventing crime. It's about using legal costs as a weapon to systematically restructure the firearms market by eliminating affordable options. It's about creating economic barriers that price working-class Americans out of exercising their constitutional rights. And it's being funded with $175 million annually by organizations that will never stop as long as affordable firearms remain available to ordinary citizens. The coming months will determine whether the firearms industry submits to this economic extortion or coordinates a unified legal defense. This fight decides if your Second Amendment rights depend on what you can afford, rather than what the Constitution guarantees. Every gun owner needs to understand what's really happening here, because the mainstream narrative about corporate responsibility and safety concerns is deliberately obscuring a coordinated attack on affordable firearms designed to price millions of Americans out of gun ownership without changing a single law. That's it for today, folks. See you in the next video.